I'm going to show you the differences between the first, second, third, and fourth gen turbos for the Cummins. There's a lot of different variations, especially if you had an automatic or manual transmission. There's also other variations if you had a flatbed or just a regular truck. This is the first gen H1Cs. This is the second gen, early second gen, late second gen, automatic second gen, third gen turbo, third gen early 2004, 2003, and a fourth gen turbo. So I'm going to start off talking about the first gen turbo. The first gen, the very first model for the Cummins that they had on the pickup trucks, had a 50 millimeter compressor wheel. Later models had a 56 millimeter compressor wheel and a 4-inch inlet. This compressor housing is not OEM, so it's a little bit different, but it's the same concept here. I'm just using it as a prop. The turbine wheel in the H1C is the same as the HX35. So the turbine wheel is 60 by 70 millimeter, which fit the second gen manual trucks. But when they switched to this HY35 from the automatic, that had a 58 by 65 millimeter compressor wheel, which was the same turbine wheel used in the third gen, which is the He351CW and the He341. The first gen had several different variations of the turbine housing, as well as the second gen. So the turbine housing is most common with the 3-inch inlet that I've seen is a 16 cm turbine housing. Some of them had a 14 cm, and there may have been some with a 12 cm, and there was definitely some with a 18.5 cm and a 21 cm. I don't know which trucks had those, so there was probably a version or different variations of the trucks that had those different housings, probably the difference between automatic and manual. The second gen model, they changed the wastegate design. See, this one comes out at the bottom. This is like a 95 model style. So that was likely done between 94 and 95. And then later it was changed to a style that came out and was bolted to the turbine housing. That was the 98 to 2002 model. So this is, and also keep in mind the compressor wheels changed. On this model it had a 54 millimeter by 78 millimeter HX35 compressor wheel. That was a 7 by 7 blade. The earlier model that was like a 94 to 95 had a 56 by 83 millimeter 8 blade compressor wheel. The turbine wheel in this model and this model and this model were all the same. So the H1C turbine wheel used the same turbine as the second gen HX35s. But keep in mind, you could have a 98 to 02 that had the HY35 if it was an automatic, which had the same turbine wheel as the third gen. The compressor wheel in the HY35 was the same as the HX35, which is a 54 by 78 millimeter compressor wheel. If you had the early third gen, which was 2003 to 2004, then you had a 54 or 56 millimeter compressor wheel. The 54 millimeter compressor wheel and the He351 was an HX35 7 by 7 blade. Now the 56 millimeter compressor wheel and the He341 was a very odd compressor wheel, and I probably do have a couple replacements laying around from when I did some upgrades. So if you do need that wheel, you can always contact us at our email address. Now this is 2003 to 2004, 2004 and a half to 2007. They switched to a 60 millimeter compressor wheel, which is 60 by 86, and that's the HX40 compressor wheel. The turbine wheel used was smaller, so it's a 58 by 65, which I mentioned is the same as the HY35. So the HY35 actually has a different bearing housing than the He351CW. It's different because of the height of the bearing housing. So the compressor wheel, like the way the bearing housing is designed, it makes the compressor wheel back 40 thousandths. in other words, on this one, the whole compressor assembly bearing housing sits in 40 thousandths deeper than this model. So you can't switch those bearing housings unless you have the proper machine compressor housing to match. The HY35, the way it was different mostly is, well, the whole turbo was different than the HX series. So the internals are interchangeable with the HX models, like the rebuild kit and such, but the bearing housing, compressor housing, and C-clip were all different, and turbine housing. So the turbine housing that was used on the HY35, it's 9cm T3, and the outlet is like the same as the HX35, but it's not the same as the He351CW that had a 4-inch outlet. But this turbine housing from the CW will bolt on to the HY35, but then you'd have to probably change your downpipe. They have the same V-band connection there. See, the HX models, they were held down by brackets and bolts, as well as the H1C models. So the turbine housings from the early first gen and second gen are interchangeable because they all had the same, were all machined for the same turbine wheel. The turbine housing from the third gen has to go on the third gen, and you probably could swap it on this HY35 from the second gen automatic, but you'd have to change up your exhaust outlet or the downpipe. For the fourth gen, there's a lot of internal variations, but I'm just going to mainly talk about the difference between the flatbed and the regular trucks. So the fourth gen, the main difference is there's a He351ve and then there's a He300vg. The VG started in 2013, and as far as I know, went up to 2020. And the He351ve started in 2007 and a half and went up to 2012. A lot of the internals are similar. The rebuild kits are slightly different, but we do offer both rebuild kits. The setup on the VE is it has a 60 millimeter compressor wheel, which is the same as the third gen. It's a 60 by 86 HX40 compressor wheel. And then the turbine wheel is a 60 by 70, but don't get that confused with the HX35 because the tip height's different to be used differently with the VGT system. The He351ve, the flatbed trucks had a smaller compressor wheel, so they had a 58 millimeter compressor wheel rather than the normal 60 millimeter compressor wheel. So all these turbos in the video are modified, so the wheel sizes are different, but I was just showing you based on the generation of the turbo, so mainly the frame. Now if you do want to buy one or a few of these turbos, I do have two of those that are available. One is the one on the far right, and then the one on the far left is the last VE turbo that I have available with the T51R mod. I try to cover as much information as I could in this video. Now there is a version, or the two variations of the HX35 compressor wheel that get people confused. That's the 56 millimeter 8 blade, and then there's a 54 millimeter HX35 7+7 blade. So often people order the wrong parts. If you're needing to order parts, replacement parts for these turbos, it's best that you contact us at turbolabamerica@gmail.com. That way I can get you the correct parts.